for a horse. And so the disappearance of this H, of an original H, I'll just call it H instead of using rough breathing or spiritus aspera. It's called Psilosis, for those of you who don't know. The disappearance of the initial H. So it's a common phenomenon. It's an even universal phenomenon. As you know, from Latin to Romance languages, the H disappears. There's even evidence within Latin for like the extreme weakening of the H, as you can see in this line from the Aeneid. Unduk is how you would have read the first few syllables. And it, also from just plainly Indo-European to late Indo-European to Proto-Indo-European to late Indo-European. So these laryngeals, like you see the word hunt in Hittite, coming with anti in Greek and even and in English. You see this H in most Indo-European languages is disappeared. Okay, so it eroded. Now, focusing on Greece specifically, there is, as you can see, an East Aegean Sprachbund in terms of sort of this weak disappearing of initial H. And it's geographical. This is a Sprachbund. That is to say, it's not so much sort of historical than geographical. So you see in Lesbos, Aeolic, and sort of East Ionia over here, modern-day Turkey, and the islands as well. Based on the earliest inscriptions we have, the H disappeared. In fact, the eta, as you well know, is used for long E in the Ionian script, versus in continental Greece, including Athens, originally the H was consonantal, was in long fricative. So it's inherited from, of course, Phoenician. So the fact that most scholars argue that the H was assigned early on, when the alphabet was created in Iliad to the long eta, would be evidence for an early psilosis occurring in this region. So what's interesting is, though, even though you have this sort of Sprachbund, this H psilosis over here, you don't have it over here. So there's a close linguistic link between Lesbian, obviously, and Thessalian, or Ionic and Attic, where these regions have preserved, the aspirations, whereas here they've been lost. And I think the most compelling hypothesis why this occurs historically was advanced by the German scholar Norbert Oettinger, who believed it's due to substrates. So Aeolic and Ionic, as you can see, is where such languages as Lycian, Carian, and Lydian were spoken. And these languages, too, had undergone, in the passage from Bronze Age, like Hittite and Luvian, through these languages, psilosis, massive psilosis. So that's a probable reason why it occurs. What early textual evidence for sort of the H? So in the middle, by the way, this region, like Naxos, Morgos, and these islands in between, you find partial psilosis based on inscriptions. And it makes sense, because it's between Euboea, which is West Ionic, and sort of the coast of Turkey. And from these regions we have, sort of from the earliest inscriptions, Morgos, you see the word opater, no aspiration, no H. It's not written at all. So there's a possibility that this would be possibly one of the earliest indications of epigraphic psilosis. And on the other hand, on Naxos, which is west of Morgos, you do find, for example, the transcription of this H you can see sort of the H function, serving double duty, as vowel and also as consonant. So, did Homer say, Homeros or Homeros is the question I'm raising. It's a complicated question, whether you believe in Homer or not. Evolution of the Iliad. I mean, most scholars agree that even if there was a Homer, his name was not Homer. Homer appears to have meant festival, was a public festival. There's much evidence for that. So the name is definitely a pseudonym. On the one hand, much evidence points to East Ionia for the compositional setting. On the other hand, our manuscripts do not show psilosis. Okay? So how do you reconcile the two? Most leading experts actually believe, from what I've gathered, and if you know a contrary opinion, let me know, that the Ur-text, if there was an Ur-text, was in the earliest compositional period, it would have been psilotic. And this is Vacronagle's theory. It was already produced in the late 19th century, and that later it was the Athenians, as they performed the poem, who inserted these original H's where none existed. And there are examples of psilosis in Homer, like epauto, leptopon, versus epalomenon. Homeric erex, hawk, versus hierax, ater, epistor. You would have expected it's a name of a Trojan. Ephistor, 5 is pi. The Aedros is well known. Opaon versus hepomai. How do we account for some of these instances of psilosis? And very interestingly, West points to this sort of reading mentioned by Stesimbrotus and Xenodotus, aiantos versus aiantos. So aiantos is the standard edition, and aiantos makes it a genitive singular versus a dative. So there's just a little bit of evidence, in fact, for psilosis among some authors. Now, psilosis may have multiple origins, and it may, in fact, be misused. In the case of, for example, the falcon hierax, it's incorrect to speak of psilosis because there may never have been an original H. Based on the Hesychian sort of entry, hierax, there must have been a digamma, as Chantal indicates. And digamma may sort of produce an H, but only sort of circumstantially. It doesn't always produce an H. You can go directly from sort of digamma to 0 without going through an H. And it's characteristic of Attica. In fact, you have often turned some digammas into H's, but inconsistently. In Histor, for example, you find it, the original Wistor becoming Histor, but you have the Adeni, which is also Oida. There's no Oida, so it depends, it's inconsistent. And also some cases of psilosis can be traced to simply the Aeolic component in epic poetry. Like Umin, Amudis is Aeolic. So the question is, for example, in this text that we have, what's interesting is we have the word opaon, which the same root as hepomai, remember? And we have the rough reading in our manuscripts, but we have opaon. Should we accept this as being inconsistent with this original, or is this like sort of an addicization of an original epitome? It's a question. I'm not sure, but the inconsistency is interesting. So, to answer the question of whether H was pronounced, I started to look at patterns of alliteration. And there isn't much in terms of statistics. It's not, from one expert I consulted with, there's no significance. But the thing is, statistics can be misleading. I cite 2 authors. In fact, I asked another friend who told me you can prove anything with statistics. It depends on what your data set is. And I still need to do more research and work with more people about this topic. But when I see a line like this, for example, it is true, it's rather rare to see 1, 2, 3, 4 aspirates. But such lines to me suggest that there was alliteration at some point. The question is whether it occurred. We'll use Homer just for the sake of convenience. In his own life, would have pronounced all these H's, or whether these sort of like H's were were part of the formulaic language that preceded sort of psilosis in Istaiumia. So let's pretend, for the sake of the argument, that in 10th century BCE, all over Greece, there was no psilosis whatsoever. okay? And that already there were formulae that were extant and later used by poets 2 centuries later or so. It's possible that this formula could have been created centuries before, and when Homer used it, he didn't pronounce them, but he inherited them, and so we have the illusion of alliteration. It's possible. I don't think it's the case personally, but it's possible. And what I've also observed is that even if sort of alliteration per se, I call this horizontal alliteration on the same line, there are passages where it's more frequent than others. For example, in book 2, there are 3 lines where you have sort of 1, 2, 3 to 4 H's on the same line. And here and here. That's extremely uncommon. And to find these 3 passages together in the Iliad is in fact remarkable. If you're tracking all the H's, and so I would like to think that for whatever reason, Homer or this composer felt inclined to throw in more H's. Now, so the cup of Nestor, and one of you will be presenting shortly, and I look forward to this presentation, is Euboean sort of documents found in Italy. This is not East Ionic. It's you could say it's definitely from the Trojan War saga with a reference to Nestor. Also, you notice the hexameter. And this is from the 8th century BCE, and you definitely see, in fact, the H's here. You see, this is like the proto H. You see hos, and it's clearly written. So we know that it was pronounced in West Ionic. And you could even argue that this is an instance of alliteration. And you could say it's just a coincidence, like Himeros, Hyanese, 2 consecutive H's, and right below, another H2. Yeah, and actually, I'm introducing the concept now of not just horizontal alliteration, but vertical alliteration. So, like this. This is what I've explored in this presentation. So, I'm introducing the concept of sandhi. So you know that a pi in Greek is an aspirate, but at the end of a word, if the word that begins with the rough breathing, it will turn the pi to a phi, because the pi and phi had the same point of articulation. Like ph was in ancient Greek. So for example, this is from Homer. Epalos on the sea. The epalos was this. This was originally epi, right? Koyu, tien, etc. So these are well-known sandhi, right? You find in Hattie Greek, etc. Now, less known is that probably all these consonants became aspirated, but we don't think of them as aspirated because we don't have in Greek a separate letter for these sounds. Like in Sanskrit, obviously you would, but this must have been pronounced unless it was Silotic, dhamma, right? And this kos, not like tos or kos, or it would be spelled like with a chi, or with a theta, and it's not. And we also know that these don't make position. It doesn't make position, so it does not lengthen the previous vowel. It's not possible to say kos or dahama. That would sort of break the rhythm. So the result of this sandhi is that these phi, ta, ka, na, etc. They're allophones of H. They're sort of like conditional variants of the H sound. And I set out to systematically explore the distribution in combination with H and see if patterns emerge. And I call this, remember these H's, the same metrical position across different lines. I call it interaspirate interlinear metrical matches. It's my temporary proposal for naming this phenomenon. And so by way of introduction, we have interlinear metrical alliteration in Homer. You will find, for example, this is the third foot, in the middle of the third foot, te, repeat 3 times. But by the way, it's short. But even though we spell it diphthong, you must have been pronounced te as well. But so we do have sort of alliteration per se of the same consonant. You could call it like homoaspirant, interlinear aspiration. And here we also have interlinear assonance. Same position, hos, ho, ho, or if you believe in psilosis, ho, ho, ho. Now, regardless, you see the same vowel, the same metrical position. And so, just some examples. Left-leaning, call it IMNs. Throughout this is, I think this is from book 5, I believe. But you see, for example, at the beginning, so from altaro, within the first foot, you see an aspirate. See, throughout all these lines, and it's consistent, you see these lines. And it deviates a little bit here. Here it deviates to the middle of the second foot, and then right in between the first second. An example of left-leaning IMM. And then clearly here you see here from the 6, you see a bunch of sort of aspirates on the left-hand side, all over. And you tend to see, by the way, when you look at, if you were to just color code the Iliad, because I've color coded the text, if you just keep scrolling down, you will see parts where you see a bunch of aspirates and parts where the aspirates are drained out with very few. And to me, this might suggest that there is, I don't know if it's a conscious or unconscious choice on the part of the poet, but that these alternations of high sort of aspirate text or passages versus slow, when you combine them, they sort of blur the stats. So you don't really know where they're located. And so it makes it difficult to make an argument based on stats. But this is an example, and this is very common, by the way. You often see a line, you often see an H beginning a line. Now you also have right-leaning IMMs. So clearly you see here, for example, all these aspirates between the 5th, at the beginning of the last foot. You see, pone, hippus, atene, eteke, hebes, hippus. You see? And here as well. And again, you see them also recurring again in the beginning. And sort of, and you know, also middle-leaning IMNs. And they tend to occur sort of in the, not always, they tend to occur in the principal singular. Look at this. Himasi, hotoi, hon, delhesi. And so middle of the 4th foot is common, and also 3rd. And sometimes you see 3rd and 4th. I find this rather beautiful. If you go up from top to bottom, these 2 parallel strings. Middle, 2nd, and 3rd is just another example. So how can we reconcile evidence of piece of Ionian compositional setting with the composition and picture attention in the Iliad? So my tentative sort of proposal is to follow one of the versions who says that Homer came from Chios. And there is something special about Chios in this sort of Psilotic universe of East Ionia. Chios, in fact, joined the Panionic League late, relatively late, in we think probably the 9th century BCE or so. One of our sources, main sources for this is Eon of Chios. And it would appear that the H was retained longer on Chios than in other parts of East Ionia. There's a strong Nubian settlement, and it was relatively recent. There's archaeological evidence for this. I cite the work of Lemos here, from the 9th century BCE. And if Chios had just been relatively recently, in terms of the Dark Ages, late geometric period, settled by Nubians, it would make sense that Homer, or the Homeridai, the competition school, the guild, was a school in which the H was retained. and had Homer or the Homeridae stems came from, say, Miletus, where probably there was Psilosis, we might have had a different text. Why is this interesting? Why is this useful? I think that there can be a variety of applications. And even if this, ultimately, the stats and all the statisticians told me that I cannot prove it with statistics, I think this could be used for other purposes, probably. Those who are interested in metrical patterns in Homer could use this stuff. But potentially what is interesting, is the question of the book divisions of the Iliad. Some defend the book divisions as they are, others question the book divisions. And I have found these IMMs connecting different books. So for example, between end of book 8, beginning of book 9, you see these, especially this string here, and here you could say it's just chance, but here in particular I think is a strong argument. And to me this would suggest that these book divisions were not original. I mean, if you're performing as a poem, surely there must have been a pause between books, right? Some sort of pause. And this, to me, pleads against the pause. That the pause could not have occurred here. And yet, this is where book 8 ends, book 9 begins. So, if the books were divided, they might have been, some of them at least, might have been divided differently. And the question, of course, is Homer exist or not? Dictation versus evolution. I tend to believe that that there was a Homer, a Big Bang, a genius poet. But I don't know. I agree with Naj that the original is irretrievable. It might have been a core. I don't know how many books or parts of what we have might have been composed in perhaps the late 8th century, 2nd century BCE. But it's also possible that later poets or his disciples expanded, and these expansions could have been very faithful, so faithful that it's hard to trace what books were later added or not. So I don't know. So I would like to know if this method could help us could give us an idea if some parts belong to a different compositional school, or maybe later or not. But I've always been suspicious, for example, of the Shield of Achilles. And it struck me as different, as odd, and sort of like thematically, and that it doesn't fit in. This Ares and Athena, for example, being the god of this city together is, I think, in cause with the way that Ares and Athena are presented in Homer. But there's an unusual high amount of sort of ancient methods. We call it diaresis, Shield of Achilles. Unusual high amount. You find it elsewhere also, but more so than in other parts. So my question is, could this be evidence of a different composer? Oh, thank you. Yeah.
That was very interesting, and sort of casts a whole lot of things in a whole new way. I wanted to quibble with one thing you said toward the end, which is the idea that because there are repeated patterns of aspiration are not across a putative book division, that's an argument against the book division. I think you could absolutely look at it the reverse way. If the notion is, I mean, I was thinking of it in terms of the music, the movements of a classical music piece, where there's absolutely kind of parallels and repetitions that link together the different movements, and the pause in between them isn't very long. So that you're supposed to kind of hold in your head what you just heard in the previous movement and take that with you into the second movement, or the whatever movement. And it seems to me that those kinds of aspiration patterns could absolutely serve that kind of function, where there's a 15-minute coffee break for everybody to go use the restroom before book 9, and then, okay, now we're going to kind of remind ourselves where we were before, partly by continuing the sound pattern that we used to have. And if the audience kind of has that in part of their oral repertory of what happens in the poem, it seems to me that would work very well as a way to kind of reel everybody back in and say, okay, now we're going to get started again, and we're picking up where we left off. So I just wanted to offer that as a possible, totally opposite interpretation of that kind of a pattern across a book division.
Oh, well, your point is well taken. It's possible. I don't know for sure. It's not a strong argument, but I would have to ask musicians how they compose as well. But yeah, you might be right.